Yes, please. Sam, yes, if you could. Hi, good evening, everyone. Hopefully you can hear me okay at the back. Cool, thanks. Good evening. My name is Louisa Uliette, and I'm curator of talks and events at the Photographers Gallery. I'm delighted to be here introducing Martin Parr and Ken Grant. As many of you may know, Martin Parr is a British documentary photographer, photojournalist, and prolific photo book collector. He joined Magnum in 1994 and has had a long relationship with the Photographers Gallery, starting with Hampton Bridge in 1978, which is hopefully correct.
The date?
Yeah, the year? The year and the show? This is what she told me. Okay. This is what she told me today. So, yes, so it's fact now. No. So fact, Martin Parr's relationship started with us in 1978 with his show Hampton Bridge. He was a trustee at the gallery for 6 years and was instrumental in the appointment of our current director, Brett Rogers. As ever, we are so grateful to him, and specifically for his contribution to tonight's event. As a contemporary of Chris Killip, the relationship was built on a foundation of mutual respect and admiration. This relationship led to a lifelong friendship. I'm sure many of you will have seen Chris's chat with Martin as part of the latter's sofa sessions in 2018. Thank you for being with us tonight, Martin. Joining Martin is Ken Grant. Ken co-curated the current exhibition of Chris Killip here at the gallery with Tracy Marshall. I hope you will have a chance to see it if you have not already. As a photographer himself, he has exhibited and published widely, with his work held in collections including the Parr Foundation. Like Martin, Ken also held a close friendship with Chris Killip. Together tonight, they will give insight into Chris Killip's work and the ongoing influence he has had on British documentary photography and British life. In terms of format, it will be largely conversational, but there will be time at the end for questions and contributions from you. We will be here for just over an hour. Thank you all for joining us this evening. We so appreciate your ongoing support. We would also like to express our gratitude to Mary Halpenny Killip and Matthew Killip, as well as the support of Martin Parr Foundation for the close involvement in the curation of this retrospective and generous loan of work. Anyway, thank you to everyone Thank you to everyone else who has supported in making tonight happen. Now please join me in welcoming Martin Parr and Ken Grant.
Thank you, Louisa. I'll kick off because I think I met, are you okay though?
Yeah, she's just going to set things.
All right.
It's okay.
Are you on? Are you switched on? We're gonna have some rotating pictures from the Killip show as we go along. So I was living in Hebden Bridge, as has just been mentioned, because I did have an exhibition here in the late 70s of the work from that era. And I basically moved there together with 5 other people from Manchester Polytechnic, the art school there. And we set up something called the Albert Street Workshop. So I was documenting the Hebden Bridge area quite closely. And I noticed through the magazines and such like that there was this hive of activity in the northeast, and it seemed to me that all these people were getting grants, and I was very envious. So I thought I must go and meet this sort of section of photography. So I went up, and in fact my initial meeting was with Circa Laser Continent, who was currently at that time living in Byker, and she introduced me to Graham Smith, who, as you probably know, is a great friend of Chris Killip, and some of you may have seen the Another Country show. Yes, you can, yeah. Do you want to do it?
Excuse me.
Okay. Can you not hear me?
Online,
At the back.
I can't hear you.
Online, oh. We want to be audible online. Don't we? Hello, onliners. Sorry about this. We'll be with you in a minute. Is that better? Okay. Is that better? Yeah. Great, thank you. Where was I? Oh, yes. Yes, Graham Smith. And some of you may have seen the Another Country show, which is on at Augusta Edwards Gallery in Cromwell Road. And it's basically reminiscent of the show that Graham and Chris did in 1985 or 86?
85.
Yeah. At the Serpentine, which is called Another Country, which for me is a real landmark exhibition. And one of the things in Augusta's show is they don't actually name which photographer took the picture. So you're sort of thrown into this medley of amazing images, and you don't know whether it's a Killip or a Smith. Those of us, I guess, who have fine-tuned our resources would be able to guess who they are. Sorry, I'm just going on and on here, Ken. Let me just tell you how I met Chris Killip, and then you can say the same.
Martin, you've just done it. You've just done the trawl right through, but which is fine, because we probably will get to another country at some point.
Yeah, I'm jumping ahead a bit.
No, that's absolutely fine, because I did want to know really what sparked your interest, because there's quite a few things going on. So did you get the grant? Did you get
No, because I was living in Yorkshire. I mean, actually, I did get an Arts Council grant, but not, the thing about the Side Gallery and the people associated with it, they got grants through Northern Arts or directly through the Side Gallery. Because at that time they were commissioning lots of photographers, including, Circa, who was part of the cooperative, and including Graham, who's also part of the cooperative in the early days, and of course Chris Killip, who ended up in Newcastle through the Gas Fellowship when he arrived. What date did he arrive there?
75.
Ken knows all the dates, it's fantastic. Anyway, I met Graham Smith, who then introduced me to Chris Killip. This would be in the late 70s, and I think the thing that had a profound impact on me was seeing his 1977 creative camera, which was very radical at the time. Was it radical because it was given over to one photographer, or was it radical? That had never been done before, and also the pictures were just amazing. And the other thing that really affected me was seeing the use of fill flash, and he did that very well. He didn't over-soak the pictures with flash. He just gives it a light touch, and you'll see some of these pictures downstairs. The big format pictures like the kid on the father, and you can see the flash, and you can see how it's lighting up the face, and the quality is staggering because it's shot on 5x4. I did actually ask Graham Smith about that process and where it came from, because undeniably, it was for all of us, it was influential. The idea of using light in daylight, putting flash into situations, and there was it done better than I've ever seen it done before. But then, speaking to Graham last year, I think it was, he was talking about getting things from the west coast of America, getting flash guns sent over, trying things out. So there was if you like, there's almost a kind of a development of process which happened almost through need and hunger and interest. Because you probably, in the 70s, you would have had a lot of the American colour photographers like Stephen Shear, people like Minnick, Roger Minnick, starting to work with colour and flash and medium format. And Sally O'Clair arrived in the country, basically going around colleges and galleries showing her the New Colour, New Work project. Yeah. And that also had a big impact because we suddenly saw that colour could be serious. Those two books were really kind of influential for that whole generation, I think. And even now, I think, looking back over some of those bodies of work, people like Nancy Lloyd, some photographers have maybe drifted off the map, Sternfeld, people who were involved in forming a particular idea about how to photograph the world. But that didn't necessarily come through in Chris's work or in Graham Smith's work. But drawing upon those processes might have done. But I'm looking here now, we're looking here at the work here. In terms of learning ways to make pictures, some of the earliest iterations, I remember being in, I think it was 1995 or 6, when Chris had a show at the Manx Museum, and myself and Mark Hayworth Booth and Chris did a bit of a tour around the island. And in his cousin Stanley's kitchen, there was a 35mm black and white picture of Stanley that Chris made in those first moments. It was only when I think he was coming back to this part of the world, back and forth, to really test things out, and even do a small show that included some of those pictures, that he galvanised enough responses to it that made him think there's something wrong here, there's something not. Well, he had an encounter with Bill Jay in Portchester Court in London. Yeah. So do people know who Bill Jay is? So basically, he's one of the prime movers and shakers in British photography. He emerged in the late 60s. He was editor of Creative Camera magazine, and he influenced many people because he, for example, showed when we were at college the work of people like Tony Ray Jones we hadn't been aware of. So he was a real pioneer, and he went with Tony Ray Jones to New York and discovered all these great American photographers. But he had a meeting with Killip, and Killip came in with his 35mm pictures, and he said to him, "Why aren't you doing these on large format? You know, you're doing very still pictures, you're using a tripod, you're crazy to do it on 35mm. And he got quite angry with Bill J. You know, here is this guy telling him what to do, and he went back, thought about it, and realized that, in fact, he was right. And of course, always in the back of our heads is the Paul Strand Hebridean book, which, you know, is very much in empathy with Killip.
Oh, very much so. You know, and he Thierry Moran, and he took it as, you know, he wouldn't deny that, of course. You know, he see that as completely inspirational, completely influential. There's a story that when Chris had come to terms with the idea that he was using the 4x5 for the rest of his life, and it was the first, I think it was the first exposure of the sheet of film, Mr. Cubbin, and he thought, I don't know what he thought, other than Bill J was absolutely right, and he had to take that process forward. But there would be certainly a kind of echo, and there's a Camera Austria wrote, I think it was Utrecht Skilson wrote an early essay about the connection between Strand and Chris Killip's pictures, and there are very great echoes. I would push it a little bit, though. I would think that Chris was very keen to talk about Paul Strand as a great photographer, but then also pulled Paul Strand apart for going to Mexico and photographing exotically, or photographing things that were in a way that wasn't like someone like Manuel Alvarez Bravo, who lived there and photographed and understood something of the culture and brought in a kind of what we might search for and call a kind of magical realism into the work. Bravo was very different to Strand, who just made an account of a place he was fascinated by. I think Chris's pictures use that template, but even though there's an appropriation, there's something else going on in the way that the people respond to him. There's a warmth in many cases. There's something else. There's been a conversation.
Well, he knew the community very well, didn't
completely,
he? Which is always the great
completely
thing that he's had up his sleeve, if you like, which other photographers often don't have.
Yeah, and there was a sense of belonging, a sense of maybe a conversation that would be possible that wouldn't necessarily be happening somewhere else. But you know, that seemed to be the process right from the start that led into that British Gas Northern Arts Fellowship to go and photograph from Bishop Auckland to Gretna Green. What's fascinating for me, and it came through in that 1977 Creative Camera, is that very early on he was making pictures that stayed with him for the rest of his life. He'd found a way of doing it.
Yeah.
He'd found a process. And then when you look at the Creative Camera magazine itself, and in fact, you've got 2 copies that you've lent very kindly to this exhibition upstairs. You see something of the hints of what might come a little bit later in terms of, he's not necessarily making a kind of logic linear narrative that's very straightforward about one particular place. Pictures are coming from different locations and they're sitting together in a really quite significant way.
I think what's interesting to look back on this is how photographers almost steal other people's ideas and visions and then can turn it into their own. And I think Killip's a very good example of that. You know, he was inspired by Walker Evans, Paul Strand, all these people, and then he found his own voice. And that's the thing that I think we can say generally about the world of photography. Not all photographers will find their own voice. They will end up being, degenerative of the original person that they're seeing. But that possibility is always there. And I think what the 77 Creative Camera proved was that by then he had a very distinctive, very different voice, even to what Graham Smith had been doing, which is also a very distinctive voice. And that's the thing that inspired me. And I think from then on, if you like, our friendship grew, and my respect for his work, and then my determination to start collecting it. Over the years, we've got the 2 dummies. I've bought the prints from Inflagranti, realizing that how important this photographer was. Because I think now, of course, everyone's loving Chris Killip, but I think you have to remember that, there was a period, after the work had come out, after another country was on it in London, that people basically forgot about him. And he was still working before he went over to America. And it's only now, in a sense, we can really sit back. And this retrospective is just an amazing opportunity to understand how one photographer worked and to see these incredible pictures on the wall.
Well, even when very recently, when with the other catalogue for the catalogue for the Another Country show over in Augusta Edwards Gallery, there's a phrase that Graham Smith uses when he writes about it, which is really about almost living on your wits. So when you're in those particular, in that era, it's great photography. There's really interesting things happening. There's very powerful things happening. He's making work which becomes almost kind of signature pictures very early on, but they're doing it in a really quite frugal way, living within very particular means. I've been to the Side Gallery a little bit, but I wouldn't profess to be an expert about that philosophy. But there was a conversation very early on with I think R.G. Collingwood about the idea of find ways to live simply and then make the work that you need to make. I think that really took Chris, because maybe it was fortuitous that he met Murray Martin, Circa Lisa, all those different people. Graham, completely central to the next stage of his life. But yes, he was doing it. There wasn't that much commercial work going on. There were portraits made, and we didn't use some of those commercial portraits in this show, but he did work occasionally.
Ian Jury, for example.
Ian Jury is great, and there is a picture in this sequence somewhere, we'll probably gone past it, of one of the greatest bass players that's ever played bass in modern music, Norman Watt Roy. But he was doing that almost as favours for people. But then there'd be portraits for literary journals as well.
Anyway, before he went back to the Isle of Man and started shooting there.
This would be in the.
This is when he came over.
This would be in the late. This would be in the late 70s. This would be in the late 70s. He'd be doing that. Early on, after meeting Adrian Flowers, as it rolls out, he starts to build a kind of friendship with people like Ian Jury, people like the painter Jeff Rigdon, a number of other people, and in fact that show with the 35mm Isle of Man pictures was with Ian Jury and Jeff Rigdon. But what was, I suppose, for me, interesting to understand about that was that he wasn't with photographers. He'd go to the Royal College of Art and use the library, but he'd never go to lectures. He'd go to Peter Blake's lectures, apparently. And then when Ian Jury got a part-time job teaching at Canterbury, he'd nipped down to Canterbury and they'd end up in Drumpy.
But there's a picture in the book of Chris at David Hearn's house, which was in a sort of real meeting place for photographers.
Yeah.
So he must have dipped in occasionally.
Yeah.
But David Hearn, the photographer, had a flat in London, and when visiting photographers from the States, like Winogrand or whatever, word got round that you could go and stay at David Hearn's flat and enjoy meeting other photographers and get a free bed.
But that was organic. That wasn't like a college course or a Royal College of Art course. Yeah, David Hearn calls it the Doss House. Or it called it, still did, and there's lovely pictures in the book from that time. Chris smoking in the way that he used to smoke. There's a picture coming up here. This picture, because one of the other people that we haven't talked about is Norman Hall, who I know that you've been doing a lot of gathering, and even now there are actually bits of research going on about the influence that this man had as a picture editor. And Chris talked about Norman Hall a lot, introduced into David Goldblatt, for example, or saying be mindful of the work of David Goldblatt. And then when I think about that and I look at some of the pictures from Huddersfield, for example, I start to see something that moves away from looking at a kind of agrarian life in the Isle of Man into something which is a little harsher. He was obviously, he did that commission, two cities, two views, where he photographed in Bury St Edmunds and Huddersfield, got much more excited about Huddersfield, north of England, taking these pictures. And then started to really develop, I suppose, the approach that we've come to know.
So Norman Hall was a picture editor of the Photographic Annual that was published in the 60s up to the 70s. And you have to remember, Britain back in the 60s and 50s was somewhat a photographic wilderness. You know, there weren't, you know, you had people like Bill Brandt working away, but you didn't have the energy that, for example, France, with that whole generation of Lartigue and co. Working away. So Norman Hall was really the voice of photography. And for example, he took the decision to publish Klein's New York in the 50s in London, which is extraordinary, and Robert Frank's book from Peru. So, you know, he knew what good photography was like. And before the sort of days of Bill J, Norman Hall, if you like, was, you know, the inspiration for many photographers in the UK, including Chris Killip, of course. So that's an important connection.
And that's where those friendships probably originated with people like David Goldblatt, which became a kind of lifelong friendship. And I certainly see the echo of certainly Goldblatt in Chris's work, probably less the other way around. But then there's probably a very clear slippage between David Goldblatt's pictures and Walker Evans' pictures in that respect. But I suppose the certainly soaking some of these things in is one thing, but also sharing it as well is another thing. So when he's in, not too long after settling in Newcastle, and the original building grows, or there's a potential to grow the building in Newcastle, which was originally Amber Films, and the idea of putting a gallery into the second building happens after the first director moved on. Chris took it over for 2 years, and that became a really influential moment, I think. And looking at the collection that they've got now, some of it, not everything, because I think Murray Martin, I think some of the other photographers were highly influential at gathering momentum and bringing things in, but the kind of things that they brought in and the kind of shows that they were doing, nothing seemed to be happening like it.
Yeah. Well, he invited different photographers in to come and work, like Martin Frank. And Martin Frank's husband is Cartier-Bresson, so he rolls up as well. Who else did they invite? Who else did Chris invite of international repute?
Well, they did lots of shows with photographers who have now become an awful lot more renowned for us. Ouija's widow, Wilma Wilcox, brought stuff over. Sid Kaplan, the photographer who's Robert Frank's printer, and a great photographer in his own right, came across and did bits and pieces. So there's a kind of network there which grew beyond Britain. Some of the exhibitions, like Martin Shamby's show, for example, everyone was talking about Irving Penn's World in a Small Room, you know, lovely. But at the same time, Irving Penn was using Martin Shamby's studio in Cusco, but nobody talked about that at the time, and Chris brought that in, or the side gallery brought that into some kind of focus in terms of working the work and celebrating the work of Indigenous photographers. So I think that kind of reach is something that, whilst people are making work in that region really, really beautifully, what else was happening is that there's a kind of gregarious nature to bringing stuff in, whether that was local work like Jimmy Forsyth, which is incredible, which Chris really loved, or whether that was, and there's Chris, this is actually a Sid Kaplan picture that made in Whitley Bay of Chris photographing, that Sid let us use for the book. So there's some, but that kind of that two-way thing about taking things on from people like Norman Hall, but also making sure other people were aware of things. I mean, that was happening right the way through Chris's life, wasn't it? You know, if you think about some of the phone calls that I used to have, or some of the emails, you know, you've got to look at this guy, Boris Mikhailov. You've got to look at this guy.
Well, what was interesting, that when he did end up at Harvard teaching, he invited all these people that he loved over to come and do a seminar.
Yeah, he did.
And you know, that was a way of him connecting. So Goldblatt, Fonkeberta, Boris didn't come, didn't he?
Yeah. Nan Golden, Susan Mysalis, who's a very good friend of Chris's, did seminars. Yeah, Chris couldn't quite understand how you could get somebody to come over who had no English, but Harvard just paid for a translator, and it was, the problem was solved. He couldn't quite work out that at the time. Funkaberta came over and did work. What was lovely is the grapevine, he'd be saying about how people were either interested or otherwise, or taught really well or otherwise. So people like the German Frank Brewer, who's probably gone a little bit, I remember seeing a show of his in the Photographer's Gallery corridor, you know. Apparently he was one of the best teachers that Chris has
Why
had.
do you think Chris actually basically stopped photographing, despite the Irish work a bit later, and turned to teaching? Any ideas, Ken?
Yeah, I think it was a really good offer to go to a place where you've been nurtured. I think there's other things, though, that, you know, just to trace back and try and look like I'm always trying to link these things together. But what we haven't really talked about is the whole reason that Chris was taking pictures like this in the first place is because he went to do set up a commercial shoot and go to the Museum of Modern Art and got blown away, not by the Bill Strand show he was expecting to go and see, but by the collection, the public collection, or the public collection, the museum's permanent collection. So things like Evans, Strand, August Sand, all those different things that we've talked about. Chris was fascinated with America, you know, and fascinated with getting to interesting places. You know, I remember years ago him saying something like, got a bit of time to take Matthew away, where would you take him? And I said, well, maybe go to Tarifa. It's great, you know, loads of reggae on the beach, I got a postcard off him the next week from Tarifa. Off you go and try and experience things. You know, he was really disconcerted once because in America there used to be the opportunity of getting night flights, so you could go from New York to Florida or New York to Philadelphia, some further afield, in fact, and you could sleep on the plane at night, but which meant that you could get to somewhere really cheaply and keep going and keep discovering certain things. So I think when there was an interest, and bear in mind we've said this against a really quite challenging economic set of circumstances for himself, when there's an interest shown to go and do something, he's rekindling all those kinds of, I would find the cheapest way of getting there once a year, and Mary is probably off in America somewhere at the moment. Chris and I would meet up and we'd go around shows. Saturday, full day Saturday, dropping into things. Not necessarily always photography. In fact, you know, photography is just part of a much bigger thing, whether it's jewellery, sculpture or something else. And that came back from his first time going to galleries in the States, probably. His really ongoing fascination with people making interesting things. You know, when he was going around London with Jeff Rigdon and Ian Jury, he'd be talking about going to find good things, not necessarily photography, but painters were saying you should go and see that, you should go and see that. That's where, if we were to try and draw threads, that's where when he saw Hamish Fulton's show in the early 1970s, large-scale photographic works, he was seeing the potential for making big prints, which you know probably a lot better than I did. When galleries were starting, there was probably one size fits all in many respects, and that kind of...
Well, it was quite radical to have the big prints, which were part of the original Another Country show.
Yeah.
Very difficult to make, because I remember they had to do it with Graham's darkroom, and they had the enlarger right up in the ceiling and projecting down onto the floor.
Yeah.
And then you have to roll these prints through a bath, and then fix them and wash them. And in fact, I've got still one of those prints which has got slightly yellow.
Yeah.
But it's the thing that inspired me when I was invited to be the art director of Arles in 2014. I decided then to just pick 15 of Chris's pictures and blow them up very big. And the pictures I chose were the more graphic ones, things that are slightly weird, like the kid on the wall, True Love, if anyone remembers that, with the litter floating through the image. The guy with the kid on the wall, you know, the kid on the shoulder of the guy. And in fact, the big prints, I purchased that entire set of prints from Chris about 10 years after 2014. So yeah, so 2004. So is it about 2014, something like that I bought them. And the big prints downstairs in the gallery come from that collection, which we have the original 15 images that were chosen. And that to me showed a side of Chris that was so distinctive. That to me was his real voice. They're the pictures I always cherish and always love. And just those 15 are so magical. And they're all represented downstairs, just there's only 3 or 4 of them in the big size.
In the large size. But I remember the Owl show. I remember it being quite a statement to have those. And I also remember I suppose the conversations about another country and what another country did in the Serpentine. In some ways, it must have felt like a provocation to put pictures of those circumstances in the central London, in the Serpentine. But at the same time, Chris was also really, from what little you discussed it, he was kind of buoyed by the response that those pictures had.
Yeah, and there's anger from them that you know, people just don't know what it's like in the north, and you could say the same today. In fact, you know, it's another world, and that's exactly why it's another country. Yeah. And I think that do you think that anger is an important part of his motivation, Ken?
That's a really great idea, isn't it? Yeah, I think the anger was an energy. I think I saw one particular side of him, which was very, very supportive and very a great friendship. But I also saw situations where he would say very clearly what he thought of things, and I think, you know, in a talk we all did in Bristol with Mary and Tracy and Niall Sweeney, the book designer, it was fascinating listening to Matthew say something about where his dad was for most of the time when he was growing up. Fascinating, but also, you know, moving to understand that. And there was anger. You know, there's also there was belligerence in a way that I've never seen it in many other photographers. You know, it's there in you, but not there in many.
Oh, thanks. It's great. Great to know that.
It's a compliment. It's a compliment.
I know. I'm taking it very well.
But it's there in a few people, isn't it? You know, and the idea. You know, what's interesting is if you think about anger. When I was up with Graham Smith last year, there was a few things floating around. One was the miners' lamp that Sunderland and Wearmouth Miners Guild or organisation had inscribed incorrectly and given to Chris as an acknowledgement for the work that he did. And you don't necessarily see those pictures. And then when you talk about them, they crop up from time to time, and they crop up because some of those pictures are used in people's obituaries and in different places. And there was an awful lot of stuff there that wasn't ever used in a public sense or shared in a public sense. It was used at the time. And I even remember, as part of the research for the book, trying to get in touch with Arthur Scargill to find out what happened to these.
Did you manage to?
Yeah.
Did you? What did he say?
Not much. He passed me on to somebody else who tried to sell me his book. But that's a different story. But what you see back, looking through all those back conversations, I suppose, is that Chris was just finishing the sequel work, and then just stopped and said, "I've got to photograph this," and dedicated his time to make those pictures in a way that comes from anger. Those pictures of those really articulate pictures of the lines of police in a community, you know, the enemy within, and all those kinds of echoes that we know about. He's photographing very, very difficult scenes, very, very oppressive circumstances, but he's photographing it with no safety net. You know, he was doing it. He wasn't commissioned to do it, and probably if he was asked, he probably made his own choices about exactly how those pictures were used. But they were essentially building a record for the region. And what was interesting about speaking to Graham the other year is there's a big set of those pictures that exist, and they've ended up just towards the end of Chris's life trying to tidy up loose ends. There was a conversation about what do you do with these different things, and he ended up giving it to the Archive of Modern Conflict, or wanting the Archive of Modern Conflict to take it because Chris saw it as a modern conflict. Yeah. So he's very clear. He was very clear about his language, very clear about the purpose for the work and how that work was going to be used.
I think as we're on Skinning Grove, it's worth bringing up one aspect of what he did that is so important, and that's how in Skinning Grove and Seacoal, you know, he managed to find a way into those communities it took a lot of difficulties. I mean, when the sea calling thing became quite a national image, so he would show up with his camera and basically he'd be told to fuck off, okay? So, he kept coming back, he kept persisting, nothing happened. And then eventually, I think, didn't he meet someone at the Appleby Horse Fair?
Yes.
That had the inside knowledge and basically, finally, he got his position into that community where he was accepted. And then to, in fact, make sure that he was part of that community even more, he got a caravan and was staying down there with the other people who had caravans. And so he was literally straight into that community. And I think that really plays off. And when you see the other pictures of sea calling, they're never as good as Chris's. And it just shows you how that determination and to be part of that community has really paid off.
And there's a lot of them, isn't there? You know, we put quite a lot in here, and it is congested as an exhibit, but I think it needs that kind of overview of how he was there and working. And he talks really eloquently. There's a lovely film. He did a show in Braunschweig with Florian, the guy who's now went to the Pompidou, and Jerome Souther, a photographer, but also a guy who runs a small gallery in Brittany, in Gwynzagel. And there's a lovely film where Chris is in the rain chatting about it, and he talked about the fact that he knew after a certain number of months of going to and fro that he was never getting close enough in the way that he felt he needed to be. Close in terms of, maybe, in terms of a proximity, but close in terms of understanding exactly what was going on. And so getting the caravan off Critch, or whoever it was sold it to him, getting the caravan, being in the caravan, being able to stay in the caravan, all these other things blossomed. And I completely appreciate there's keynote pictures, or there's those figure pictures that we all stop and
marvel at,
can't get past, yeah. and then there's other things, and they're to do with life in the camp. They're to do with children growing up. They're to do with food. They're to do with mealtimes. I mean, Chris trained until he found that 1964 issue of Parry Match. Chris was on a really great run towards being a catering manager, and even in his, anybody will tell you he could cook. I've got a really great recipe, which you might like to see, which is his recipe for chicken curry, except he's crossed chicken out but lamb because he's really. he says he said.
He likes lamb being free range.
And then everything else, he's argued with it and he's changed things around. I'm digressing, but I'm not digressing. What I'm suggesting is he knew how to host people and how to share things with them. So if you see the Seacoal book that's styled in, you open up those gatefolds, you see picture after picture after picture after picture after picture of Chris's caravan and people in the caravan. And that's because, he would feel like he could shelter people. And you can't fake that. You really can't fake that. I've seen lots of we've all seen pictures in those regions and in difficult situations, and you can be found out very, very quickly if you're not the person you really are.
And likewise, in Skinning Grove, I guess it's worth mentioning his connecting with Lesso.
The fisherman.
Was absolutely crucial, because some of the Skinning Grove pictures are some of his best. And again, it's getting into that community that really made him have the ability to take these pictures so close. You look at these pictures and no one's looking at the camera. Yeah. Why is that? It's because he's there all the time, and people get fed up with looking at the camera, and he's just part of the scenery. So that's why the pictures are so great. And then this great tragedy happened where this great friend of his basically got killed at sea, and then he was able to actually provide an album of 30 pictures of Lesso between the ages of like 13 and 17 to his mother. So things like that, it really shows how profound, how significant photography can be within a community.
There's a number of different occasions where he'd do something like that, and he did a little presentation for me in Liverpool when I was involved with the Open Eye years ago, and somebody asked him about, can photography change anything? The usual big question, and he said. He just told that story and talked about the fact that he thought he'd done something useful in that situation. And he went through the process of saying he thought that when he was first asked by the mother of one of the drowned fishermen, did he have any pictures, he said no, thinking she meant really good pictures that Chris would probably exhibit. But then he realised he's got tons of pictures of this really beautiful situation, so he goes into that world and then digs them all out. I think that's there. I think there's also with Skinny Grove, there's also something that people don't normally talk about, which is the connection between. In fact, this is that video, but there's no sound, so we won't. But you can just see something about when he was talking about this work. But he would draw a line between the kind of experiences that he had in Peel growing up in the fishing area and the kind of experiences in Skinny Grove. He recognised in the suits that the old men wore a similarity to what the old fishermen in Peel would wear. So there's a lineage there, I think, which made him, if not understand everything completely, because there's probably different kinds of economies going on in that place, he understood something about how a fishing community ticked and how difficult it could be, how stop-start it could be, how all those kinds of different things could be part of that process to think about.
I think it's also worth talking about the station, because his approach to doing that was quite different. So this is the last book that was published during Chris's lifetime, and how these pictures came about, which is basically a huge punk club in Gateshead, was Matthew, his son, was at his studio a few years ago, like 5 years ago or so, and noticed this set of contacts from the station of these punks that he'd shot. And he said, well, what about these, Dad? Let's have a look at these pictures. So he had basically forgotten about them. So he looked at them, got them printed, and said, yeah, I'm quite happy with these. But it's worth remembering, completely opposite to his approach to, say, Skinning Grove, he went to the station, he had a suit made, which had basically pockets for his 5x4 slides. He had his big Norman flash, his portable Linhof camera, and I think within his jacket he could maybe have 10 dart slides. You've got 2 pictures on either side. And he wore a jacket, really smart. And he was there for 6 months. And in that time he was there, no one ever asked him what he was doing. And I find that quite remarkable. And he came back with this, this great set of pictures, some of which are downstairs. So some of the time he didn't actually get to know the community because he could just do it without doing it, if you like. So I don't want to give the impression that every project that he did, he got to know that community.
Dead right. But what? Now this is just me going off on a riff here. But if you look at the pictures of Skinny Grove and you see a lot of the kids, they're all. One of the first conversations I had with Chris Killip was about the Angelic Upstarts, the punk band, because I went to see the Angelic Upstarts, and that was my era. And I thought, this man has photographed this band, and and of course it was at the Barbary Club in Sunderland. It was a miners' benefit concert. So we had a really, really, I suppose for me, interesting conversation about what he was doing and why he was doing it. And you look at the Skinny Grove pictures, all the kids who Chris was friendly with, Whippet. He's got an album under his arm called Punk and Disorderly. There's other kids. There's a certain moment, which is 1981, which is to do with, and I'm not going to go off on a conversation about punk music, but there's a certain kind of moment which is to do with a certain kind of music and austerity, that A word that we use now. But at the time, all those kids were into it. So the kind of lads who were going out fishing, they were playing music. Whippet's got his little cassette player. They're listening to that kind of stuff. They're angry. There's a kind of economy that they're all involved in. Sometimes up on the hill working in the foundry. Sometimes out fishing. Very busy, very industrious. But they're living on their wits. And then you realise that Chris has got into all of that. The miners' strike kicks in. All that kind of dedication that he gives there, and then somebody tells him about the station, the punk club. The kids who are in the station, whether they're exactly the same kids or not, they're into the same kind of things. So he recognises something, I think, of the spirit of those kids when he's in there. Doesn't know them in the same way, doesn't have those kinds of relationships, but there's something about the fact that, and it's a kind of, it's a collective, and they're helping each other and they're figuring out ways to do something. So I think I can understand how he left it, and there's just a few pictures that crop up from time to time in the publications. But I can see why he was fascinated with it, but also why it seemed so different that it was only years later. And when that happened, I know he was working with Niall Sweeney and trying to figure out ways to make sense of that. I remember having a conversation with him about music magazines, New Musical Express, Sounds, all these inky, rubbishy papers, but it's to do with the scale and the fact that something could happen. And off he went. Right then, all of a sudden you get the large format, you get the pages showing this work with the energy that I think somehow equated to the time he was there and experiencing. So it's fascinating.
And how about I noticed in the exhibition there weren't Irish pictures, correct?
Yeah.
Unless I missed them.
No, you didn't miss them.
So he did a book about Irish pictures in colour. Talk us through that, Ken. Why did he do that, do you think?
He did it when, in 1991, a woman called Christine Redmond, who is the saint of Irish photography, if people haven't met her. She's a wonderful, really, really supportive, really great woman. Did lots of things, gave over her house to people who were photographing, caused lots of arguments by putting Crass Clement books on the table over a breakfast time, and photographers would fight as if an impressionist painting had been unveiled for the first time. Really wonderful woman. And she invited Chris to do a workshop. Chris, one reason or another, agreed. Somehow I got mentioned as being the technical assistant, and so we all go off with an enlarger, some developing trays, chemicals, on a ferry over to Inishmore and the Aran Islands, where what goes on the island stays on the island. But what a wonderful place. And it's where I first saw Chris as a teacher. He hadn't long accepted the role at Harvard, and so he was trying out different things. He was trying out ways of teaching. At the time, probably not necessarily thinking about making pictures in Ireland, but then he did make some, and then went back. And I think it was when he spoke to his mother that she said, what's the fascination with Ireland? Don't you know you're a quarter Irish anyway? And he realised that there was something there that he was interested in. At the same time, and I'm probably muddying it a little bit, but there was a moment when Dan Goldin came and did a 12-week semester of teaching for him, which he said was, in many, many different ways, fascinating. But she was also using a small camera at that time. And when he came back to Ireland again, he started to make pictures and work with that kind of portability. Speak to lots of people and they'll not know really what to make of those pictures. But when we did the book, Niall, it was a wonderful time working with Niall, the designer, talking to Tracy, whose heritage is from that part of the world. You start having a conversation about where these pictures fit. So you get something of the complete and utter immersion of the station, very close to the pictures of Ireland. But I suppose he did it as a kind of discovery. He did it as a kind of figuring out where he was in things. And I don't think it's been as appreciated as it maybe could be. A lot of the work that he did was made in small communities, small pilgrimages, things that were not the main pilgrimages. A lot were about responding to the land, to the vernacular of a landscape, to what a landscape feels like. You know, we did workshops for maybe 4 or 5, maybe even 6. I can't remember how many we did in the end. They were incredible, but he was getting more and more excited about these regular things he was coming back to, and he'd always build them around very busy times for himself. But he'd also have that block of time to come over for a spell and work his way through that part of Ireland. He even went up as far as Belfast and photographed in Belfast, which nobody ever, but yourself, a lot of the work that we celebrate, and rightly so, is made in that phase. But I remember being in Newcastle with him in 1996, and he left me in the house, and in the armchair, there was very little in the house. He was just renting the house, and in the house there was on one armchair there was boxes and boxes of exposed colour negative 4x5 film, and on the other arm, a copy of Jean-Paul Sartre's Nausea.
You say these are colour negatives?
Colour negatives.
But not exposed?
No, exposed. Exposed.
Did you ever see those images?
I had a peep. I had a peep.
What were they like, Ken?
People.
In Newcastle?
In Newcastle, and places and housing developments. What's interesting, and for me, and I remember, this is long ago before the days of mobile phones, I remember being in a call box in New Brighton, the Wirral, which you know very well, speaking to him on the phone, because he said, give us a ring at this time, gave him a ring, and he'd been in Newcastle photographing, and he was completely and utterly blown away, in a bad way, by how ill people looked. Mm-hmm. So this was maybe 4 years after he started to really, and he'd only originally gone to Harvard for a year, and then after a spell, and it's, you know, Mary was great helping us work out exactly how that all unfolded. But he was given tenure, but Harvard is Cambridge, Massachusetts. It's a completely different place. It's not Jarrow. So when he came back, he did some pictures, and he did pictures with people, and they're all in Boston.
And
still.
I just don't think he liked them, did he? He felt as if that magic that he got from that sort of that industrial time wasn't there, and therefore he felt the pictures didn't really work.
I think he
Would
felt.
you say that's right?
I think he felt he couldn't. I think he felt really traumatized by, if that's the right word, by what he saw, and he didn't feel he could lift a camera in the way that he maybe did when he was absolutely fluent, you know, living up in Bilkey and Gateshead and out every day and photographing. You almost kind of get tuned into something, or you become acclimatized to something maybe, which when you step out of it and go back into it, there's something else is happening.
And interestingly, I think it's worth noting that, you know, when he got to America, and he was there for what, 20 years, he never did a serious picture in the States. No. He would always say, everything's been done. You know, how can I ever be as good as the likes of, you know, the great names, Leif Freelander, Winogrand, whoever, you know, what's the point? You know, so I'm just not going to do it.
No.
So I think it's interesting in his later life, you know, he got quite sort of disillusioned about the subject matter. And I guess that's why he ended up doing less photography, basically.
Yeah. 2017.
Oh, is it time for questions? Sorry. Louisa, where are you? What time did it start? 6:30, was it? Sorry?
I tried to wave.
Right, oh, hi. Do you think we should open it up now?
Do you want to finish your last point, and then we can open up?
Yes. Were you having a last point, or was I? I think you were, Ken.
Shall I have a last point?
Yeah, you have the last
Shall I have a
point.
last point?
Pint or point?
I'll have a... No, we haven't had the last point yet.
You were talking about why he sort of stopped working. And,
Yeah.
And that was quite interesting to...
I don't think...
a bit further.
Yeah, thank you. I don't think he did stop working. And I'm going to be a little bit floral about this, but I don't think he did stop working. When I was trying to work on the structure of the book, it felt like a real obligation. You know, I don't even know whether we got it right, really. I think I did. But part of what was fascinating for me was in those later years, yes, he never photographed in America. Family pictures, barbecues, going to Cape Cod, you know, beautiful times with Mary and the family. Lovely. But there was something else going on, which was almost like, and I talk about being, when you're in the middle of something, sometimes you're tuned into it, or you're sometimes snowblind to it. He had a wall, which he called it this once, he called it a wall of death. And there's all these people on the wall, like Lezo, all these people he remembered. Not everyone was dead. I was on it. Not everyone was dead. You know, what's the catch your breath? Some things, some people are dead, some people are alive, some people are dead when they're alive, and there's something great about that. Well, I'm open. I don't end up in that direction. But he had all these different people there, and he'd come in. I was very careful not to belittle some of the Isle of Man folklore, but there's certain places in the Isle of Man, the bridge at Stanton, I think it is, where you go over and you say good morning to people as you're going over the bridge. And he'd go into his studio and say good morning to all these people on the wall every morning, have a little conversation with them. That's just wider context. In 2017, when we were over there, he was going through all this stuff because he was close to retirement and he was pulling all this stuff out. But you realised that the conversation was still going. So the conversation that happened with Uta Eskilsson, for example, with the Pirelli pictures, getting those rekindled, the Seacole pictures, the Skinning Grove pictures, the book's, rumoured to be nearly out, but we still haven't seen it yet. Mm-hmm. But he was working on these things, and Skinning Grove, he said it was probably the most difficult for him because he knew that he felt so much about that work. And, you said tonight you feel that some of the best pictures are in there, but also some of the closest relationships he had with people are in there. Beva, the guy who's still alive, somebody really kindly sent me a picture earlier in the summer of Beva, who ended up helping Chris do the distribution. Mm-hmm. My point is, the last point is, I think the intensity and the connection didn't wane. I think he found different ways to go through it. Mm-hmm. How many hours he sat. Apparently Kent, his assistant, said that he'd sit there in the summer with the Tour de France on the screen while they're going through negatives and talking about the work and scanning, making sure everything's exactly how it should be, and so all those kinds of connections were maintained. That's why the working with Niall Sweeney and Pony, doing those 4 zines towards the end, absolutely committed in the way that he always was. So yeah, he didn't photograph in America, but I think the connection is kind of maintained right the way through. That was my final point.
Okay, let's open it up. You've got a roving mic, it seems. Anyone? No hands at all?
Okay.
Oh, there's a hand, look.
Yeah, sure. Good evening. It's a big fan and very much amateur around techniques and everything, but I am fascinated that perhaps the subjects within the environment, how would you articulate that you managed to avoid judgmental sort of views of the people, perhaps? And I'm thinking even in the lighter tones, Martin, that you use in New Brighton, perhaps some of the darker stuff in Birkenhead. Were you conscious of perhaps avoiding the viewer to be judgmental about those people?
I mean, I think it's a question of showing it as it is. I mean, when you say judgmental, I mean, it's true and it's not true, because you go along, you have a motivation. So the motivation for me with New Brighton was to sort of contrast the shabby backdrop. It was during the time of Thatcher, in front of the families still going there, because that was a place, if you were a Scouser, that would go on Sunday afternoon to take the kids out for a fun fair and a paddle. So is that judgmental? I don't think it is. I think inevitably there's politics there, but it's sort of hidden. It's not immediately evident that is the motivating factor. And I think the same would apply with Chris, because we're talking about this anger, and the 80s was a very good decade for documentary photography because it was the time of Thatcher, and that really helped motivate us. I can't see being in the time of Liz Truss being quite the same, or maybe Rishi Sunak.
You'd have to be quick,
get us all up there, out again. But that was a hugely important aspect of what we were doing. Because, for example, I make this crazy statement, all photographers, documentary photographers, photojournalists, they're from the left. You can't do it if you're from the right. And if anyone, apart from the people that might be working for Fox News, can tell me of a right-wing documentary photographer, I'd be amazed. It's like the BBC looking for a right-wing comedian. It's almost impossible to find them. Has anyone got any names for a... There's a challenge.
Sorry, hopefully you can hear me. There's a question from YouTube. This is to Martin from Tia Chapman. What are some things that you learned from Chris about which each of you... Oh, no, this is for both of you. What are some things that you learned from Chris about which each of you think about every day?
God, I mean, I guess the thing I learned from Chris was, how to take a great photo. And also, one of the things I haven't really explained is, in the last 20 years, he's always been my sounding board. So whenever I found something interesting, I'd tell Chris about it, whether it's a book, a photographer, and he would come back to me, and generally speaking, we would agree. The only thing we disagreed on, interestingly, was when Jeff Dye did his book on Winogrand. I thought it was terrific, and he thought it was terrible. But apart from that, that was the sounding book. But I look at these pictures that he's got, 5'4", the kid on the shoulder, the guy on the wall. I look at these pictures, Skinning Grove with everything, the crab pram and the car and the guys looking at everything so perfectly in position. I think that is the highest aspiration that you can have as a photographer. These pictures are just perfect. And, I'm inspired every time I look at them, and I look at them frequently. Just going around the show this afternoon is inspiring because these pictures are so phenomenally good. And, we have to say that he was the key post-war British photographer, and In Flagranti is the key photographic book. And
that sharing of information, the sounding board, as you say, I think that's fundamental, because that really nourished me right the way through. Well, from my 20s onwards, that just completely and utterly changed everything in many respects.
And interestingly, I bought, when Chris retired from Harvard, I bought his photographic collection. Many of the things were the books that I told him about, like there's a copy of Bye Bye Photography by Didier Moreau, because I'd sold my books to the Tate. So I then had to go and buy them all again, and basically I got an easy ride. So I just bought Chris's collection. He was retiring, he didn't want to take it with him, so I bought his books. And if anyone comes to the foundation down in Bristol, you'll still see the wall, which are Chris Killip's book. And you can go through there and you can pick out, say, a book by Gregory Halpin, who was one of the people that basically Chris had mentored. And, there's this amazing dedication to the book, in Halpin's first book, to Chris, without you, this would never happen. So these are wonderful little touches that we've got in this collection. And so as well as buying the 15 pictures that I showed in Arles, I also bought his collection. And these, of course, are now safely stored at the foundation. I should give a plug for it, really. It's the Martin Parr Foundation down in Bristol. We're open 4 days a week. Come and visit. And we have a fantastic membership scheme where you can get a Martin Parr signed print, dead cheap, if anyone's interested in such a thing.
There's another question back here.
Real pleasure to be at a discussion between three such linchpins of British photography. I just wondered how important you think the clothes were to Chris's pictures, because, the clothes of the time seem to the subdued nature of the clothes seems to really fit the black and white style of photography. I know, a lot of pictures you shot again in the 80s, I think as time goes on, it's harder to find such distinct style tribes, if you know what I mean. How important were clothes
I think the whole idea of documentary photography is to try and capture those times and clothes and how people design their houses, the interiors of shops are absolutely key, even how a car looks. I've got a picture taken in the 80s of a woman filling up with petrol, and you think that's a very unpromising subject matter for a photograph. But you look at this picture and the pump is completely different, the clothes are different, this old Ford that she's got is gone, and you realise the value of documentary photography. So as well as having great pictures, we also have the added bonus of seeing what clothes people were wearing, and this is so important. I mean, the reason why I'm sort of very passionate about this and about British photography is why I set up the foundation down in Bristol to give a platform to these photographers, not just Chris, but of course we've collected Chris very, very keenly, but to the other great British photographers. Generally, some of them are underrated. I think, even now, in a sense, it's crazy that the Photographers Gallery are doing Chris's retrospective when 10 years ago, all the galleries in London were offered the retrospective that was being started at Uta Eskelsen at the Museum Folkwang, and no one took it. So thank God that it's on here now, and thank God for Ken, being able to write this fantastic text to accompany the book, and for Tracy and Ken to have curated the show. So yes, it's not been easy to recognise and give a platform to an amazing photographer like Chris Killip. Sorry, I moved away from the close our discussion there. But
Do you think it's harder now to make good pictures with like all the different style of clothes? Like it's hard to find.
I don't really know. No. I just because it's not the. It's not. You know, years ago I had pictures of a couple of girls, and they had these T-shirts on that said "Naf Naf," N-A-F, Naf Naf. And then I found another one of my contact sheets, Naf Naf. And then I found another. I thought, Jesus, what's this Naf Naf thing? I hadn't even seen it. You know, I'm sometimes really stupid and I don't see these things because I'm maybe looking at what's going on. But then they become really significant because my interest is more my contemporaries and photographing my contemporaries and the kind of things that I do and, you know, share the spirit of. But then I might not necessarily get involved in photographic exhibitions in a pure sense, but a lot of the football pitches, for example, they've been in fashion exhibitions with musicians and clothes designers, and because people understand there's something that we've done that's really significant and that holds on to something that's probably past. I love the station pictures because that was something that I'd probably have ended up enjoying at the time. And it was interesting talking to Niall Sweeney, the designer, because Chris inadvertently, through his interest in Skinning Grove and in the miners' strike, ended up in that place and made a record of a place in a way that nobody else did. And I think that became treasure. And thank you to Matthew for digging it out and telling his dad to look at it a little bit more closely. What's interesting is there's probably other things in Chris's work that we still haven't seen that's equally significant.
We have another question from YouTube. This is from Battersea Workbund. To what extent does photography change anything? Sequel was the first time I became aware of the power of photography. It helped form their political views and propel them into journalism. So what do you think, I suppose, is the ongoing impact of photography today?
Oh, good. I mean, there have been some examples, like Vietnam Inc. from Philip Jones Griffiths was said to have changed or helped to change public opinion of the Vietnam War. But generally speaking, I would say, I don't think photography has changed that many things. What do you think, Ken?
Well, you can go, you can list them. Sean C. Hare, working to better the environment around the Standard Oil plant that he was working in, and this was corporate America, things like that. You could probably find there's those big things like Vietnam Inc. But I think it depends on how you quantify changing things or making a difference or making things that happen. There's so many. Mark Neville, who's doing stuff at the minute and fundraising, and who did the stuff in Corby and in a previous project that was actually exhibited here a while back, I think. So, people figure out ways to make their work do something useful for the communities in which they work.
And I think the whole society would be poorer without having. The great thing about being a photographer, you can be an individual. You don't have to have a crew. You can just go out on your own, take pictures, put them on Instagram, make a book of them, whatever. And we appreciate the fact that this is a great opportunity for an individual to express something about their life and to understand how their lives are running and their connection to the world out there through photography. So without that, we would be a lot poorer. I mean, look, it's fantastic. All these people showed up tonight. They must have had an interest in understanding Killip and why he's good.
Another question back here.
Hello. You both knew Chris very well. What aspects of his personality do you think allowed him to not only gain access to these communities, but also, when there, draw out such extraordinary portraits?
I mean, I'd say he's good with people. And I think all photographers have to be good with people, but he was extremely good in making those connections. And it's absolutely a key part. You can't be a documentary photographer unless you actually like people and find them interesting and get on with them and want to hear their stories. It's absolutely essential. Would you say?
Yeah. Chris used to turn up at points when he was least expected. And and stay a night, 2 nights, 3 nights, not more than 3 nights normally, and then he'd disappear, and he'd kind of waft away into the sunset with Van Morrison playing in the car CD player, and I used to think, I'm so glad he was here. I'm so glad he was here because there'd be fun, there'd be knowledge, you know, there'd be wisdom. If you had a pile of pictures, you could say, stick CK on the back of any of those you think are okay. But really it's about, I remember going to see a Polar Ego show at the Tate with him, and just coming out of that, the two of us looked at each other, tried to say something because it was such a good show, couldn't say anything, and just laughed because it was such an amazing experience. And when you're around him, you'd always get some of that, whether that's generosity, whether that's energy, whether that's let's do something. I remember going to Harvard in 2000, and just to visit really, but he ended up putting me in front of a group of students, and it was quite a fascinating experience. But at the end of it, he said, I'm taking Ken to Redbone Steakhouse tonight, and all the students just, because it's such a strange place to go. But he would always give that energy a chance, you know, to go somewhere, try something out, and that's what I really, really loved. And I suppose I tried to talk about it a little bit when we talked about the caravan, when he was in the caravan. People wouldn't necessarily go into the caravan and spend time with him unless, you know, they enjoyed that experience. And, you know, Mary, who's in Boston right now, was telling us a couple of weeks ago when she came over for the opening that she'd been round to different parts of the Northeast and stayed with Graham Smith and gone to visit people, and gone to visit Brian and Rosie, who are in the Seco pictures, who is one of the, I suppose, the key protagonists in that series, and they just spent time probably talking a lot about what had happened to them since, but they were still so connected to the energy that Chris had shared with them. They loved him. You know, Bever, all these different people in Skinny Grove loved him, and I think we all kind of got a bit of that. And you know what I was going to say about some of the, when we went to Ireland, we did these workshops, and he did a slideshow, and a slideshow is something that he would do as an introductory class to his students. And the question online before about what did you learn from Chris, I think I understood something about what you can do when you're sharing photography with other people. I always thought I could do it quite well, but probably not a patch on what he did. But the whole premise of the slideshow it kind of finished with the idea of tenderness, and I think that became absolutely apparent in how he worked with people. And when you see the wider sets of pictures, I think some of that starts to come through. And you know, so whether it's being around him and really enjoying it, whether it's being, you know, the first workshop we did, I did it for nothing, and I got back to Christine Redmond's house after going away to see somebody, and he'd left a shelf full of film for me because he knew that I needed film to make the next pictures. I didn't ask him for film. So there was something about it. He understood how to make things happen, and I think that's what people liked. But at the same time, there was something absolutely genuine about being there and being interested in something. It wasn't half measures. The last thing, very, very last thing I'd say is that he told that really beautiful story about Cartier-Bresson always being youthful, and I think Chris had some of that in him, and I think that's what he really sparked off Cartier-Bresson, with the idea of being a youthful, you know, whether you're 70, 80 or 90, and Martin knew him very well, there was always something energetic, curious, and thoughtful about the world, and that was there as well, all the time.
I think we have time for one, possibly two more questions. There's a mic over there. You wanna go?
Yes, thank you for this amazing presentation on Chris's work. A question I have for you is for both of you, is that the work that Chris has undertaken is photo documentary, and it has a historical significance. And perhaps some people would say the brand of his photography is quite traditional in execution. And given all the bells and whistles that are around today and what technology has graced us with, I use that word very gently when I say graced us with, looking outward, what kind of an influence do you folks think Chris can have of future documentary journalists that can create imagery that will have a historical significance?
Well, I think that's a really good way of rounding things up. You know, a lot of the conversations that we've had with people, or people have interviewed and discussed this show, have been saying something about the fact that the work seems so relevant now, and has all those and in some ways, you know, of course it's relevant now. We've got echoes of certain things, but we've got very different kinds of scenarios. We've got very different kinds of technologies that we can draw upon. We've got different ways of distributing work in the way that we might not have had in the time that Chris was working. But I would always, some of the people who ask me that, what do we have? Why is it so popular now? I would say it's kind of never been unpopular in some ways. And I think the strength of Chris's work, when you do anything, you know, if you're doing any kind of conversation with students, or you're posting pictures about things, that all of a sudden there's an interest, all of a sudden there's a connection that people make with that work. And that I don't think that's ever waned. I think that's always been there. And I think that comes from his, I think that comes from Marquetta, who talked about Chris a lot, would say Chris could be wrong about lots of things, but not about photography. And he had a very clear sense of what he would allow to be exhibited and how it would be. So this show came from his first selection, if you like. But then he'd also have a kind of clarity about how pictures worked, and also an innovation, I think, in how when we've talked for an hour and a bit, and we haven't even talked about inflagranti, and we probably won't now, but there's things there that I don't think have ever been bettered. And there's things there that probably came from support from other people and working with interesting minds. But I think those kinds of breakthroughs in that work are the kinds of things that people take nourishment from now and maybe take forward now. So when you think about contemporary practitioners, they may be still drawing upon some of the energy that's in that work, but they've got the potential plurality of different kinds of languages to bring into play in a way that maybe Chris wasn't even thinking about at the time.
Have we come to a natural end?
Yes, I believe so. Do you have any final comments?
Any final comment? Any final word?
Any final comments?
Long live Chris Killip.
I've got no final comments. I've said too much already. I think.
Well, thank you everyone for joining us tonight. My special thanks to my colleagues at the Photographers Gallery, particularly Sam Mercer and Janice McLaren, and to Ralph Pritchard for your help and support this evening, and to Ken Grant and Martin Parr. Thank you, everyone. Do please come back and visit the show if you haven't had a chance to, and also visit us online to see what else is to come. We'll have a fantastic talk with Tracy Marshall in the new year. Yeah. Bye, everyone. Thank you.